Hello everyone and welcome to today's programming video. Today we will solve the Leetcode coding interview question called house robber. So we have been given an integer array nums and each value in this array represents the amount of money of each house, and we need to return the maximum amount of money that you can rob without alerting the police. So technically speaking, we need to add up the non-adjacent numbers in the given array and calculate the largest sum possible. So let's look at the example that we have been given here. Example, we have the array with these elements 1, 2, 3 and 1. Now the restriction is that we cannot take from adjacent houses, which means we cannot add two adjacent numbers. So for example, we cannot add 1 and 2 here, nor can we add 2 and 3, nor can we add 3 and 1. But we can add say 1 and 3, or we could add 2 and 1. So if we add 1 and 3, we get 4, and if we add 2 and 1, we get 3. So the maximum that the robber can steal, or the maximum sum, is 4. First instinct might be to add up all the values at odd indices and separately add up all the values at even indices, and then just return the larger of the two values. So we added the values at index 0 and index 2, and we added the values at index 1 and 3, and then we compared the two sums and we picked the larger of the two. But this approach won't work for an input array such as this one. So using the even odd approach in this example, the sum of values at odd indices, which is 2 and 8, and this 1 is 2 plus 8 10 and 1 is 11, and the sum of the values at even indices, which is 8 plus 1 is 9 plus 2 is 11. So the maximum out of these two is 11. But if you look carefully, if we add 8 here and this 8 here, we already get a large number, which is 16. And if we go further to add this 1 here, we get 17. So the maximum amount that we can take, or the maximum sum for this array, is 17 and not 11. So the approach of using even and odd numbers will not work for all values of the nums array. So we'll have to use a different approach. We'll have to use some sort of a dynamic programming approach here. So what's the maximum amount the robber can take at the first house, or what's the maximum amount that we can add up at index 0? So what's the maximum amount that the robber can take from this house or this index? As you can see, it's going to be 8 because that is the maximum here. There's no house before this. Let's go to the next index. So let's check the max amount at index 1. Now remember that the robber cannot rob two adjacent houses, so we cannot add up nums of 0, that is this value here, and this value here. We can't do that, because if we do that, that means we are taking the amount from two adjacent indices or adjacent houses, and that is what will trigger the police alert. So the maximum amount at index 1 can be either the maximum at index 0, which is 8, or the value at index 1 itself. So the robber has to now choose one of the houses to rob first. So they can either choose the first house or the second house, because they can't rob both of them, right? Because that is not allowed. So in this case, we will pick the value at index 0, because that is higher of the two, and we'll say that is the maximum amount the robber can take at index 1. So let's save the value 8 at index 1. Now let's move the variable I to point to index 2. So we'll move to the next house now. Now, since the robber cannot steal from adjacent houses, we have to take either the amount at the previous house, which is here, right, and not steal this current house, because you can't do adjacent houses, or the robber can take the amount from this house here and the amount at the previous to previous position, or the maximum amount which they would have taken at the previous to previous position, or 2 positions before the current position, which is here. So they can either take 8, which is that, or they can take what is in the current house, which is 1, which is here, and add up what they have taken before, which is the 2 positions before the current position, which is 8 again. And if you use the max method and just pick the larger of the 2, you have to pick 9 because that is the larger of the 2. So what we're saying here is that at index 2, right, at index 2, the robber can take the value or take the amount at the previous position or the amount at the current position and the amount at 2 positions before the current position. And they have to take the larger of the 2 because we want to maximize the amount taken. So in this case it will be 9. So let's store this 9 in index 2 now. Okay, so I hope it is making sense so far. Okay, so let's say now we want to check the next index. So I is pointing to index 3 here. So now we want to calculate what is the maximum amount we can take from this house. Okay, so we can take the amount in this house, which is 8, okay, but we can't take the amount in the previous house. We can take the amount in 2 positions before this house, right? So we can either take, so between 8 plus 8 here, 16, or we don't take this 8 and we just take this 9. Okay, we can't take 9 and 8 because they are adjacent, right? So we can either take the 8 at position 3 and the maximum amount at 2 positions before position 3, which is position 1. So 8 plus 8, 16. Or we can have a look at the previous house, which is 9. And now between these two, 16 is the higher. So what we're going to say is that at index 3, the robber can take maximum of 16. So let's go to the next index, which is here. So what do you think will be the maximum amount that the robber can take at this index? So it will be the max or the greater between the amount at this house which they can take plus the amount 2 positions before this house. So that is 9, which is the maximum at index 2. We can't do 16 plus 2 because they are adjacent. So if we are taking 2, we can't take 16. So we can take the one before 16 here. Or we can just take the previous house's amount and stop there. We don't take the one at index 4. So between these two, 16 is the higher. So we'll save 16 at index 4. Okay, now I is at index 5. So the maximum amount that the robber can take at this last house is either the current house amount, which is 1, plus the amount 2 positions before this house, which is 16, or they can completely leave the current house alone and just take the max at the previous house. That's 16. And 16 plus 1 is 17, and 17 is the larger of the two. So we will store 17 at index 5. So the result would be, which we need to return, is 17, which is actually in nums of the length of the array minus 1. We saw that we didn't change the value at index 0 because that's the first house, and when we reached the second house we had to choose between the first house or the second house, and we picked the larger of the two. The base case will be that for nums of 1, so which is this index, we will store the max of nums of 0 and nums of 1. So basically the robber has to pick which house is going to rob first, right? So he needs to know, is this bigger, is this having more amount, or is this having more amount? So we have already covered index 0 and index 1. Now we can check the remaining array in a loop. So we can say, I going from equal to 2 to n minus 1, where n is the length of the array, right? And we can say that at each array position in these nums, we will calculate and store the maximum amount that the robber can take at that index or that house. So it will be nums of I will be equal to the max or the bigger between, or the larger of the two between current house's amount, which is nums of I. And remember that it can't steal from the previous house, right? Because they're adjacent. But they can steal from the house 2 positions before this one. So they can take the amount from I minus 2. Okay. Or, they can say that, okay, there is a larger amount at the previous index. And that is probably, if it's greater than, both these two added up, then we'll just take the previous amount. So they can either take the total of the current house and the house 2 positions before, or they can just take the previous house, which is I minus 1. And that's literally it. And finally, we just return nums of I minus 1. N minus 1, because that's where the largest amount or the highest amount will be stored in this array. The one thing we have to remember is that in this problem here, it says the length of the array can be minimum of 1. So if that's the case, we will have a small problem here that we are trying to access the second element in the array. So as a first step, we'll have to check, if the nums array is 1, size is 1, then we just return the first element. We don't have to do any of this. So that's like a safety check to prevent array index out of bounds exception. So now let's implement this code. So as I said earlier, we will calculate the max amount at each index and store it back in this nums array itself to save some memory. We'll leave the first element as it is, and we'll set the value in index 1 to be the greater value between index 0 and index 1. So this is our base condition. Now let's iterate to the rest of the array and calculate the max value which we can take at every index. So we'll have to start at index 2 because we have already calculated what we need to store at index 0 and index 1. So nums of I, or the value at I which we'll store, will be the greater of the two values between what we can store or what we have at the current index plus the value 2 positions before the current position, or it could be just the previous position. So we need to find which one is bigger. So as you remember, we can't take from the previous position and the current position because those are adjacent. So we can take from the current position plus the previous to previous position, or just the previous position. And finally, as we saw earlier, the maximum amount is going to get stored in the last element of this array, which is what we will return. We need to do one more thing, and that is handle this condition. So if the length of the input array is just 1, so you have only one house, then that's the only one the robber can steal, right? Take from. So we'll just return that value. Okay, let's put some more test cases. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you find this video useful. If you have any questions, please do let me know in the comment section. Please do remember to like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.